I watched a graduate student conducting field work in a remote village last summer, and it felt less like science and more like a carefully rehearsed play.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
He looked the part perfectly, the rugged travel clothes, the high-end voice recorder, this serious furrowed brow of an intellectual deep in thought.
What uniform?
Exactly. He was interviewing a local elder, nodding rhythmically as the man spoke. And look, to an outsider, it probably looked like a profound exchange of cultural knowledge.
But you saw something else.
But then you looked closer at the mechanics of the conversation. The elder would speak for maybe 2 minutes, passionate, waving his hands, clearly agitated about a local land dispute, his voice rising with genuine emotion.
Right, a real human moment.
A completely real moment. The student, who didn't speak a single word of the local language, would then turn expectantly to his hired interpreter. Now, the interpreter, he just looked bored, maybe a bit uncomfortable, and you could tell he just wanted to avoid getting mixed up in a serious, locally sensitive political issue.
A very dangerous position for him to be in.
Absolutely. So he summarizes that entire emotional tirade into one flat, sterile sentence. He says, the community values traditional farming methods.
Wow, just completely sanitized.
And the student, he didn't question it for a second. His face lit up with this specific kind of academic satisfaction. The look, the satisfaction of data confirmation.
I know that look. A polishable insight.
Precisely. He immediately scribbled into his notebook, probably connecting this clean little sentence to some high-level theory about agrarian resistance or post-colonial hybridity.
He wasn't hearing the man.
He wasn't there to hear the man. He was hearing only what he needed to hear to finish his thesis. And that moment, for me, it just captured the crisis perfectly. The student wasn't there to learn from the world. He was there to perform the ritual of being an anthropologist.
And the notebook was a prop.
Just a prop to prove he was present. It made me realize that somewhere along the line, social science stopped looking through a window and started staring into a mirror.
That image, that mirror effect, where the discipline just reflects its own procedures and, its own expectations back at itself, that perfectly frames the mission of this deep dive for you.
It really does.
We're looking today at this deep structural failure that happens when social science, in its urgent pursuit of legitimacy, of structure, of academic credentials, prioritizes the ritual of research.
The sheer performance of the method.
The performance of method, exactly, over the messy, uncomfortable, and often really surprising pursuit of actual truth.
So, to be clear, we're not talking about outright malicious fraud here, though of course that exists.
No, this is something deeper.
We're talking about a deeper systemic failure, a kind of intellectual self-deception that's built right into the training and the publishing pipeline.
And you see this issue manifesting everywhere.
Everywhere. Whether you're working in the qualitative world doing deep ethnographic field work like that student, or you're in the quantitative realm of experimental psychology, this methodological obsession has led to massive failures.
Failures in everything from qualitative insight that's supposed to inform policymaking, right down to the quantitative reliability in published papers.
It's the crisis of performance.
It is. Our mission today is to pull this crisis apart, to investigate its manifestations in detail. We should probably start by examining the qualitative world, looking at how fieldwork becomes this choreographed performance.
And how academic theory acts as a kind of alibi, shielding researchers from the banality of their actual findings sometimes.
Yes. Then we can zoom in on that human intermediary you mentioned, the interpreter, who acts as an essential but deeply political filter on reality.
And then finally, we will shift gears completely. We'll go to the hard numbers, tackling the replication crisis in quantitative fields like psychology.
Where the argument, and it's a powerful one, is that their massive intellectual credibility crisis is rooted not just in bad statistics, but in fundamentally weak theory.
The methodology itself is allowed to provide the intellectual structure that the theory just lacks.
Exactly. The ritual takes over.
So let's start with that qualitative side. The critique is leveled mainly at anthropology and ethnography, and, the core argument is brutal.
It's pretty scathing.
It's that these fields today often end up studying themselves and their own methodology, not the world they originally set out to explore. The method is treated, as you said, like a sacred ritual.
A ritual that has to be followed no matter what, regardless of whether it actually leads to discovery.
It's the institutionalization of process.
It is. When you talk about anthropology, the fieldwork experience is, it's no longer seen primarily as a means of gathering knowledge or testing a hypothesis or encountering the unfamiliar world.
It's something else now.
It has been fundamentally transformed into an initiation rite. It's the crucial rite of passage for the graduate student.
Ah, so the goal shifts.
The goal shifts completely. It moves away from genuine discovery to successful demonstration, proving you can successfully perform the role of the anthropologist under field conditions.
So student success isn't really measured by whether they generated some novel, paradigm-shifting insight that the academic community didn't already have.
No, not at all.
It's measured by the successful completion of the performance.
Exactly. Did you document a certain number of formal interviews? Did you diligently note observed behaviors in the specific required format? And crucially, did you make sure that the final findings align with the theoretical lens that was pre-approved by your supervisory committee?
Often before you even stepped onto the plane.
Before you even left the country. It's a professional choreography.
And this choreography has, it has devastating real-world consequences, right? Especially when we talk about applied anthropology.
Absolutely. The kind used in contexts like NGO development work and international aid. This is not just an ivory tower problem. This is a public funding and policy problem.
Can you give us a concrete example of this methodological fetishism leading to a policy failure?
Certainly. Let's look at a development failure in the Mekong Delta. It's a classic case study of good intentions failing because of this rigid adherence to ritual.
Okay.
The project focused on building expensive new agricultural irrigation infrastructure aiming to improve crop yields in a rural area. A dedicated anthropologist was hired to ensure the intervention was locally sensitive and, sustainable.
These are so good.
And they meticulously followed a prescribed technique known as participatory rural appraisal, or PRA.
Wait, let's unpack that. Participatory rural appraisal, PRA. What does that ritual actually involve? It sounds very official.
It sounds great on paper. PRA is a qualitative methodology that's designed to ensure bottom-up engagement, meaning the local people, not the distant NGO headquarters, are supposed to drive the project design.
So it's meant to be democratic.
Highly democratic. The ritual involves very specific workshop formats, large group mapping sessions, seasonal calendars drawn on giant sheets of paper, and preference ranking done with sticky notes or colored beans.
Sticky notes.
Yes. The anthropologist then meticulously documents the input from these workshops, which, by the way, look incredibly impressive in a final report because they demonstrate active community engagement.
So the methodology itself, the performance with the sticky notes and the charts, that becomes the proof of legitimacy, regardless of what the charts actually say.
Precisely. The anthropologist returned with a thick report confirming bottom-up participation and demonstrating the community's stated desire for this new canal system. But the truth was, of course, far messier.
Of course.
The villagers were, at this point, veterans of the international aid circuit. They were highly skilled in what you might call the development dance.
They knew the steps.
They knew the ritual required by the NGO to secure the funding. They performed the role of the empowered community flawlessly, providing the exact answers that would check all the boxes on the PRA checklist.
But those answers weren't the real story.
No. The crucial, unaddressed cultural reality was this. The expensive new canal infrastructure they built, based on all that PRA data, cut directly across a spiritually significant ancestral boundary.
Oh, wow.
This boundary was mentioned, of course, but not in the formal, structured, high-stakes workshops. It was mentioned in the ignored, messy, informal conversations that the anthropologist had with individuals.
The conversations that couldn't be easily translated into a workshop output or codified into the final PRA report.
Exactly.
And the outcome.
The outcome is that the entire expensive infrastructure project sat unused. The villagers couldn't, or maybe they wouldn't, use the canal because it violated a sacred boundary, an issue that the method itself systematically ignored.
That's a perfect encapsulation of systemic failure.
It really is.
Yeah.
The system rewarded the performance of the method, the detailed documentation of the sticky notes in the workshops, over the actual complex human context that prevented the project from functioning.
And everyone gets what they want except the people the project was for.
The anthropologist gains their credential, the NGO gets its report demonstrating effective local engagement, and the project fails, often in quiet obscurity. It just demonstrates that when method becomes the goal, the outcome is often the active suppression of necessary truth.
This shift where method dominates reality, it leads us directly to the function of theory in modern social science. You know, how it often acts less as a guiding light for genuine exploration and more as a Procrustean bed.
That's a powerful metaphor, and it's very academic, so let's break that down.
Please do. What does the Procrustean bed mean in this academic setting?
It's a great metaphor because it comes from Greek mythology. Procrustes was this mythical host who would offer a bed to travelers. If the traveler was too long for the bed, he would just chop off their legs to make them fit.
And if they were too short?
He would stretch them until they fit.
Brutal.
In academic terms, the theory is the pre-sized bed. It takes the messy contingent reality of the world and it either stretches or chops the raw data until it fits the pre-existing, often rigid theoretical frame.
So theory in this model, it no longer waits for discovery, it precedes it.
Yes, it exists to convert what is ordinary or surprising or even just obvious into the dense, often opaque jargon that's required for publishable insight.
Right.
Take a simple, undeniable fact. You conduct research in a particular society, and you notice that older men wield significantly more authority than younger women in public discourse.
An observation that has sociological truth in countless societies worldwide.
A very basic observation.
But you can't publish that observation as is. It's not sophisticated enough.
Correct. You have to convert it. So that unsurprising observation becomes academic language. Gendered hierarchies persist through embedded structures of patriarchal kinship, demonstrating the systemic reproduction of authority.
And you have to add the flourishes.
Oh, of course. You add the necessary flourish that intersectional dynamics complicate the role of age in local governance. The primary function of these sentences isn't to convey new information, but to act as signals.
Signals to whom?
To the journal editor, the review committee, the whole discipline. They announce that the writer belongs, that they are fluent in the required high-level theoretical vocabulary.
It's just jargon inflation, taking a banal encounter and elevating it into a theoretical event.
And this conversion process, this stretching and chopping, is where theory operates as an alibi, a shield for the absence of genuine discovery.
So let's make this concrete.
Let's think about the hypothetical experience of a doctoral candidate. Let's call her Elena. She spent a year in the field studying urban youth in a major city in, say, South America. Her department supervisor has mandated that her research must address the framework of post-colonial resistance via new forms of digital connectivity.
That is her Procrustean bed.
That is the bed.
And what did her actual raw data reveal?
Her interview transcripts, the actual voices of these teenagers, spoke mostly about, well, universal youth culture. They discussed American pop music, their struggles getting into specific universities, their obsession with video games, and surprisingly, their career aspirations in banking and finance.
In other words, overwhelmingly non-revolutionary, non-resistant, and non-post-colonial data.
Her reality actively contradicts the high-level theoretical framework that the university requires for her degree.
So she's sitting on thousands of words of interviews that fundamentally undermine her entire thesis. What is the intellectual survival mechanism in that scenario?
It's a brutal mechanism of self-selection. To survive, she has to discard the majority of the contradictory quotes. The 50 interviews that say nothing theoretically interesting and highlight the one vague statement about, say, a local musician using TikTok to post political satire.
And that one quote gets magnified.
That single quote can be successfully translated into the required theoretical language of subversive digital activism as a form of resistance to globalized cultural hegemony.
So the world is used merely to decorate a conclusion that was already written back in the literature review.
It serves as an alibi for the lack of genuine learning or challenge to the existing theoretical structure.
The field stops being a test site for theory.
And it becomes merely a backdrop, a stage for demonstrating the theory's predetermined universality.
Yeah.
The student is rewarded not for bringing back a surprising new reality that challenges the theory, but for successfully translating reality into the theory's existing language.
It is a system built to reward intellectual obedience over intellectual bravery.
Absolutely.
This takes us from the failure of the researcher's perspective to the most critical layer of filtration in any qualitative work, the interpreter.
The human filter.
Right. If our goal is deep, complex human listening, but the person generating the final thesis doesn't speak the language, the recorded words are, by definition, twice filtered. The interpreter is an active agent, not a neutral glass conduit.
And this creates a profound epistemological problem, a crisis of how we know what we know. The words recorded in the final field notes are often just the shadows of the original conversation.
Just shadows.
We have to move entirely beyond treating interpretation as a simple technical word-for-word transaction. The interpreter is a person embedded in a dense web of local power, politics, and identity.
Their own background matters.
Their own political affiliations, ethnicity, class, gender, and personal history profoundly shape how they capture meaning, emotion, opinion, and feelings.
So we have to make a vital distinction here between words, the literal semantic translation, and voice.
What's the difference in your view?
Well, the voice is the full conveyed meaning that includes tone, emotion, body language, context, and even silence.
And the interpreter's own positionality, where they stand in that social landscape, that determines which voice gets articulated. This is especially stark in conflict zones,
Where the interpreter's intervention can be a life or death calculation.
literally filtering out dangerous information.
Let's look at that crucial filter in a high-stakes environment. What happens when the interpreter is under intense political pressure?
Okay, consider a Western ethnographer working in a conflict-sensitive region of Myanmar, relying on a local interpreter we can call Kaya. The ethnographer's research question revolved around political dissent and documenting state oppression.
So the risk level for Kaya was astronomical.
Through the roof. He knew that military intelligence had informants everywhere, and that a misstep could lead to detention or worse for himself or the interviewee.
An impossible situation.
During a formal interview, a villager provided a long, metaphorical, and frankly terrifying account of oppression, using local vernacular and loaded imagery to describe their fear of the military regime.
And Kaya has to translate this.
Kaya, acutely aware of the risk, turned to the researcher and engaged in what we have to recognize as fearful interpretation.
Fearful interpretation.
He deliberately summarized the entire political and emotional critique into a brief, safe, economically neutral statement about economic hardship due to climate change and market forces.
So the resulting field note, which the ethnographer took back home, documented economic hardship. It was objective, clean, and completely wrong in its analysis of the political situation.
Kaya filtered the truth. He did it to protect the villagers, and maybe to protect the ethnographer from having to hold that politically volatile knowledge.
It raises these intense, uncomfortable questions about the very ethics of knowledge production.
We are forced to admit that anthropological insight often represents the safe version of the story that the local context permitted the researcher to hear. The final research outcome is fundamentally shaped not by the truth, but by the local socio-political pressures that restrict the flow of truth through the interpreter.
And this positionality, this filter, it's so much more complex than just political safety. It's dynamic, it's constantly shifting based on identity in all its forms.
Right, you can see this in the contrast between case studies in post-war Bosnia-Herzegovina or BIH in Nicaragua.
Okay, take the BIH case first. What was the landscape there?
The research landscape there is defined by deep ethnic and political divisions. Bosniaks, Bosnian Serbs, and Bosnian Croats. The researcher employed a young, highly educated Bosniak male interpreter.
And the moment that interpreter opened his mouth,
His political identity was recognizable to the participants, instantly.
so his identity immediately affected the data he was collecting. How did that manifest?
It meant that non-Bosniak or nationalist participants became extremely cautious. They were euphemistic, or they just flat out withheld information related to sensitive topics like ethnicity, war guilt, or political grievances.
All because of the known Bosniak ethnicity of the interpreter.
Precisely. The researcher noted that the participants treated the interview as a political performance, filtering their answers for the person sitting next to the Western outsider.
Wow. Even down to the language used.
Yes, it manifested in subtle linguistic ways too. On one occasion, a non-Bosniak participant corrected the interpreter's use of language, specifically distinguishing between the terms Serbian and Orthodox to describe Bosnian Serbs.
A seemingly minor correction.
But it revealed the intense nuances of identity and allegiance that the interpreter was actively, perhaps subconsciously, mediating and sometimes smoothing over.
It sounds like the researcher had to become acutely aware of the interpreter as a variable, not a constant.
Absolutely. The researcher had to actively manage the filter. They sometimes found it necessary to arrange interviews at specific times that excluded the primary Bosniak interpreter, allowing them to use an interpreter of a different ethnicity for especially sensitive meetings.
Or just recording it.
Or even recording the interview for later translation to try and achieve better neutrality. This shows a deep engagement with the interpreter's positionality as an essential factor in determining data integrity and safety.
Now, the Nicaraguan case study you mentioned presented an entirely different configuration of positionality, right? Less about static ethnicity and more about a complex insider-outsider status created by migration.
That's right. That interpreter was a Nicaraguan male who had fled the Civil War as a child, gained refugee status in the U.S., and was later deported back to Nicaragua after 18 years abroad.
So he returned with this incredibly ambiguous hybrid identity.
Exactly. He was physically local, yet culturally Americanized. He spoke Spanish with a distinct accent, having grown up socializing largely within Mexican communities in the U.S.
That hybrid identity would be a massive, unavoidable variable in a region where the political memory of the Civil War is still so acute.
It was a game changer. Participants often assumed that because the interpreter had fled to the U.S., he was inherently anti-Sandinista. This perceived political identity, even if the interpreter never stated his views, intimidated some participants.
It led them to withhold information.
Highly sensitive information, or to adopt a cautious political stance during the interview. The researcher confirmed this later. After the interpreter left, participants would relax, recount deeply personal stories of the war, and reveal their true political positionality.
Sometimes directly contradicting what they had said only minutes earlier.
Exactly, contradicting what they said in the presence of the perceived Americanized outsider.
This just underscores that the interpreter's mere presence, their biography, is a political instrument in the room.
And in that same Nicaraguan context, a critical ethical conflict arose that dramatically highlighted the clash between competing ethical frameworks.
What happened?
The complexity escalated when the interpreter engaged in sexual objectifying behavior to the researcher and local female participants. This included making inappropriate sexual comments to a teenage married couple and their sister shortly after a formal interview.
That's a situation that forces a crisis of trust immediately.
It did. The researcher intervened immediately, apologized to the family, and asked the interpreter to leave, viewing the behavior as a profound violation of their own professional and personal ethical framework.
But the local women's response was unexpected.
Very. They were largely bemused by the researcher's outrage. They essentially told the researcher there was nothing to complain about, stating that that is how men are, what they were used to dealing with daily.
Wow. That is a perfect, painful example of how deeply held ethical frameworks can clash. It forces you, as a researcher, to stop and think. Is my job to impose my external ethical code or simply report on the reality I encounter?
It revealed that tension perfectly. While the researcher's ethical code mandated non-objectification, that code conflicted fundamentally with the local cultural acceptance of the behavior. The established trust between them collapsed.
The relationship had to be terminated.
The interpreter's ethical representation, or lack thereof, was critical to the project's integrity, forcing the researcher to end the professional relationship. It just underscores that interpretation is not merely a linguistic task. It requires a shared ethical understanding that is often hard to establish and maintain across severe cultural divides.
So if that's the reality in fluid ethnographic fieldwork, how does the interpreter function when they are formally embedded within rigid, large-scale institutions? I'm thinking of what are sometimes called total institutions.
Like humanitarian organizations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. These organizations, due to their internal security constraints, their massive scale, and their standardized organizational structures, they function effectively as total institutions. They intensely shape the positionality of their staff, heavily limiting individual agency and defining roles very tightly.
So the position of the interpreter is defined almost entirely by their relationship to the organization and the people it serves.
And we see two very different archetypes of interpreters emerging in this environment, based on their employment status.
Right.
On one side, you have the archetypical ICRC interpreter. They are often highly educated expatriates, recruited from the pool of potential aid workers. They are financially secure, regular, well-paid employees.
And their tasks are incredibly sensitive.
They often involve EST visits, which stand for Interview Without a Witness, conducted in high-security detention settings. The role is highly professionalized. Their interpreting work is contingent on their status as humanitarian aid workers and often serves as a pathway to becoming a full delegate.
They're seen as part of the mission.
Yes. And then you have the UNHCR interpreter, who is at the complete opposite end of the power and security spectrum.
How so?
The UNHCR interpreter is typically a refugee herself. or a beneficiary of the organization, hired as a low-status incentive worker. They are highly dependent on the organization for income and for their continued presence and well-being in the camp or processing center.
And their tasks are often high volume and incredibly high stakes.
Like RSD refugee status determination interviews.
Let's stop there for a second. Refugee status determination, RSD, is paramount. The interpreter's work in that setting can literally determine if a person lives, dies, or receives asylum.
Absolutely. The RSD interview is the ultimate gatekeeping event. The information collected determines the entire course of a human life. And this places immense, impossible pressure on the UNHCR interpreter.
They're caught in the middle.
They may feel a deep pressure to align with the organization's mandate to find objective facts, or they may feel compelled to align with the applicant as a fellow refugee who understands the suffering.
Which can lead to bias.
This often results in a subtle but significant biasing of the interpretation, maybe to help the UNHCR official evaluate the credibility of the applicant. This can compromise linguistic accuracy in order to mitigate human suffering or secure aid for their community.
So the formal definition of humanitarian interpreting has to be multi-layered to acknowledge this impossible ethical burden.
It has to be. Humanitarian interpreting is formally defined as practices falling within international humanitarian law and refugee law, aiming specifically to enable beneficiaries to access their rights.
The interpreter is embedded in a context of intense human suffering.
And their ethical responsibility extends far beyond simple linguistic accuracy. It extends to facilitating the humanitarian objective itself. Their role as interpreters is secondary, really contingent upon their primary status as humanitarian actors, either as aid providers or as dependent beneficiaries. And that fundamentally distorts the lens through which they transmit information.
Okay, let's take that qualitative filter and put it aside completely. Moving now to the world of seemingly objective, hard numbers science. Experimental psychology. The replication crisis in this field is well documented. But the argument we're seeing here is that it's not just an engineering problem.
No, it's fundamentally a theoretical crisis masquerading as a statistical one.
Explain that.
That is the crucial insight, distinguishing a statistical fix from a philosophical one. For decades, highly trained scientists have been systematically misusing standard statistical procedures, specifically the null hypothesis significance test, or NHST.
And they do this in a desperate, often unconscious pursuit of statistical significance.
Right. The academic publishing environment, which historically demanded significant results to publish, created a toxic self-reinforcing feedback loop, and that led to a massive glut of type I errors.
False positives.
A huge number of false positives.
Okay, we keep using the acronym NHST. For you listening who haven't been in a university statistics class recently, what exactly is the null hypothesis significance test, and why is it such a weak foundation for scientific discovery?
Right. The null hypothesis significance test, NHST, is a statistical procedure designed to assess the probability of observing your data, assuming there is absolutely no effect in the population.
That's the null hypothesis, H0, but the difference between two groups is 0.
Exactly. When the resulting p-value is low, typically below 0.05, you conclude that your observation is so rare under that assumption that you reject the null hypothesis and say your result is statistically significant.
But the core issue, as critics like Paul Meehl pointed out as far back as the 1960s,
Decades ago,
is that the null hypothesis, that there is zero difference, zero correlation, zero effect, is almost never true in the real world when you're dealing with complex human behavior.
If you measure human traits long enough, you will always find some non-zero difference. Therefore, NHST is fundamentally testing a straw man.
So the mere ability to reject that straw man null hypothesis became an easy alibi for testing weak theories.
Precisely. Psychology has historically been satisfied with weak theories that only predict the direction of an effect. Group A will score higher than Group B, rather than predicting the precise size or magnitude of the effect.
And NHST allowed researchers to build successful, prestigious careers without ever having to develop the kind of rigorous quantitative models that require precise predictions.
The kind of predictions that would be standard in, say, chemistry or physics.
The ritual here, then, is the pursuit of significance testing, which has led to what is now commonly called p-hacking.
P-hacking, where researchers manipulate their data or their procedures until they get that magic p-value less than 0.05.
And this manipulation is now empirically demonstrable, right? It's not just a suspicion.
No, it's plain as day in the data. If you plot the frequencies of published p-values across thousands of psychology papers, you see something deeply unsettling.
What do you see?
Under normal statistical conditions, you would expect a smooth, continuous distribution of p-values, maybe clustering around the low end, if all the theories were true. Instead, you see a significant and unexplained anomalous frequency peak.
A suspicious bump in the
A
data.
huge bump, sitting right at p equals 0.04 and p equals 0.049. This indicates that researchers are regularly engaging in procedural or analytical tweaks to nudge results from just above the critical p equals 0.05 threshold to just below it.
That's the academic incentive system laid bare. The requirement is not truth. The requirement is a p-value below 0.05 so you can get published.
And it doesn't stop there. If you look closely with the frequency plots across 25 different scientific disciplines, you often see a minor but discernible bump near p equals 0.10.
What's that about?
This suggests researchers are also p-hacking just enough to be able to use the woeful phrase marginally significant. The sheer scale and uniformity of this behavior indicate a fundamental crisis in research reliability driven by institutional pressures.
What are some of the common practices that researchers use to nudge their results and achieve this magical significance?
They rationalize it. They do it under the guise of efficiency or data cleaning. A pervasive and methodologically dangerous practice is called optional stopping.
Optional stopping.
A researcher starts with a small, inexpensive sample size, say 30 participants, runs the NHST, and if the result is non-significant, they just add 5 more participants and run the test again.
And again and again.
They continue adding subjects in small batches until the result crosses the line into significance. This process, which seems harmless on the surface, drastically increases the probability of a type I error, a false positive.
Because if you run enough tests, you are eventually guaranteed to find a false result just by chance.
Exactly. And when you factor in this optional stopping, small sample sizes, and the low prior probability that the tested hypothesis is actually true in the first place, the implications are dire.
How dire?
Under typical psychological research conditions, where perhaps only 1 of 5 tested hypotheses are actually true, it is estimated that nearly 1/3, or a horrifying 32%, of published significant findings may be false positives.
1 in 3. That statistic is staggering. If 1 in 3 published results is likely unreliable, the entire empirical foundation of the field becomes questionable.
It does. And it exposes what Paul Meehl called the paradox of precision in NHST-dominated fields.
Okay, this is a really compelling critique. Let's walk through it.
In the hard sciences, like classical physics, theories are expected to make highly specific point predictions. The particle will be here with this velocity at this time.
Right.
If measurement precision improves, if the error interval narrows because you buy a better telescope or a more sensitive sensor, it actually makes confirming the theory more difficult. A better measurement forces theories to get better, or they are disconfirmed. Precision forces progress.
So better tools challenge the theoretical core.
Yes. Now look at psychology using NHST. The inverse is true. If you improve measurement precision in psychology, perhaps by using more reliable scales or larger samples, the standard error interval narrows. This makes it easier to reject the strawman null hypothesis, H is 0.
Even if the mean of the data does not move at all and the effect size remains trivial and meaningless.
Exactly.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this. In hard science, getting better tools makes it harder to prove your theory, but in psychology, getting better tools actually makes it easier to publish a result, even if that result is completely meaningless.
Precisely. The methodology itself rewards theoretical weakness because a vague theory that merely predicts a non-zero effect is easier to support with ever-improving measurement precision. A trivial effect becomes statistically significant, not because the discovery is profound, but because the measurement tools are sensitive enough to reject a null hypothesis that was never likely to be true in the first place.
This is the ultimate defense mechanism for weak theory.
And Meehl warned us this would happen. He argued forcefully that you are never going to get a cumulative, rigorous science like Newtonian physics out of conclusions that just amount to, if you pull on the object, it moves.
The lack of rigorous point predictions means the field is structurally incapable of producing cumulative, deep knowledge.
It does. And that indictment suggests the problem is deeply ingrained in the epistemological roots of psychology itself, the fundamental nature of what it seeks to know.
It points to a fundamental mismatch between the quantitative methodology and the ontic nature of the human psyche.
The actual subject matter of psychology, the nature of consciousness and motivation. because the discipline in its early history lacked a strong, unified theoretical hard core to define what the psyche is and how it operates.
The quantitative experimental methodology stepped in to provide that structure and direction.
Exactly.
So the methodology became the theory. That sounds like a fundamental problem. A research program protecting its tools rather than its understanding of the human mind.
In a sense, yes. If we look at the Lakatosian model of research programs, which posits that a theoretical hardcore is protected by a flexible belt of auxiliary hypotheses, usually methodological adjustments in psychology, the core is vacant or vague.
So the methodology takes over.
The methodology, the empirical quantitative focus takes over. It becomes the protective belt that defines how phenomena are approached, systematically sidelining anything that cannot be easily measured and quantified.
And if the methodology is then fundamentally questioned, as it is in the replication crisis, it risks becoming a degenerative research program.
It generates increasingly sophisticated data that is less and less connected to the actual object of investigation. Researchers become more mathematically rigorous about less meaningful results, engaging in what some critics call mathematical sophistry.
Where methodological tools become purposeless toys. This leads us back to that provocative conclusion. What if the human psyche contains a crucial non-quantitative dimension that current quantitative methods fundamentally elude?
That is the essential challenge. If consciousness, emotion, and subjective experience are, in part, non-quantitative, then attempting to resolve the crisis merely through statistical tweaks, like using Bayesian analysis or larger samples, will be insufficient.
The problem isn't that we're using statistics poorly.
It's that the tool we chose, quantification, may be fundamentally inadequate for the job. The crisis is not just an operational accident. It's an inevitable systemic failure caused by a lack of fit between the epistemic level, the quantitative method, and the ontic structure, the non-quantitative aspects of the psyche.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today, moving from the ethnographer in the remote field to the statistician in the lab.
It's a wide spectrum.
And yet, across qualitative ethnography and quantitative psychology, the unifying thread is strikingly clear. The substitution of a reliable, repeatable ritual for the uncomfortable, contingent, messy reality of the world.
The system rewards performance over truth. The anthropologist performs the ritual of fieldwork, the workshops, the note-taking, the correct theoretical conversion to gain credentials and career advancement.
While the social psychologist performs the ritual of significance testing, the packing, the small samples, the directional hypothesis, to gain publication and academic standing.
And both are rewarded for the performance, not for the genuine, often difficult, truth revealed.
And this fixation on ritual, this tendency to ignore the real structural and political issues that lie beneath the surface, it feeds directly into broader international policy failures.
It does. This structural ignorance was brilliantly identified by James Ferguson with his concept of the anti-politics machine.
Ferguson's work on development failures in Lesotho, South Africa, is the ultimate real-world application of this whole phenomenon.
It is. The development project there, which was meant to improve the local economy, systematically failed in its own stated terms. It didn't lift people out of poverty, but crucially, it succeeded in another, much more insidious way.
How did it succeed?
The development discourse was used to completely depoliticize resource allocation. The project reports ignored Lesotho's actual context, its history as a grain exporting region, and critically, its contemporary role as a labor reserve for apartheid-era South African mines.
They isolated Lesotho's economy from the massive capitalist context it was entrapped in.
They intentionally defined the problem as isolated and traditional, making it a perfect target for technical aid intervention rather than a political problem requiring political change.
Right. They turned deeply political decisions about resource allocation,
like strengthening a repressive local government or diverting retirement savings,
into seemingly neutral technical solutions to technical problems.
Exactly. Things like, for instance, sustainable commercial management of livestock. The discourse itself masked the deeper structural issues, such as the need to preserve a pool of cheap labor for South Africa. The net effect was that the technical intervention preserved the status quo by depoliticizing the economy.
So the failure of the method became an instrument for maintaining a much larger problematic political structure, because the system could only process technical problems, not fundamental political realities.
The ritual became the ultimate alibi for the failure of policy.
So if social science is to recover its function of genuinely seeing the world, it seems it requires a profound shift in intellectual culture.
We need to abandon the need to constantly wrap banality or even failure in dense theoretical language. We must learn how to describe the world simply, without the need to decorate it to be seen as intellectually serious.
Simplicity is not failure.
Simplicity is the beginning of honesty. We must be willing to admit when in fact nothing new has been seen and fundamentally question any claim that cannot be verified without relying on that protective, self-reflecting mirror.